The Vietnam War is one of the most significant and painful conflicts in modern history. It was a war that lasted nearly 20 years, with devastating consequences for millions of people. But how did it begin? What led to such a long and brutal struggle? In this documentary, we'll take you through the history of the Vietnam War, explaining the key events and what made it so complex. The roots of the Vietnam War go back to the end of World War II. At that time, Vietnam was under French control, but the people of Vietnam wanted their independence. In 1945, a man named Ho Chi Minh led the fight against the French. Ho and his communist forces won the battle, and in 1954, the French left Vietnam. But Vietnam was divided into two parts: the North, controlled by the Communists, and the South, supported by the United States and other Western countries. The division was supposed to be temporary, with the goal of holding elections to reunite the country. However, those elections never happened, and tensions began to rise. The world at this time was in the middle of the Cold War, a period of political tension between the Communist Soviet Union and the capitalist United States. Both superpowers wanted to spread their own influence across the world. In Vietnam, the North was supported by the Soviet Union and China, while the South was backed by the United States. The US feared that if Vietnam became communist, other countries in Southeast Asia might follow, so they began to support South Vietnam with money, military advisors, and equipment. Meanwhile, the North, led by Ho Chi Minh, wanted to reunify the country under a communist government. In the early 1960s, the situation in Vietnam grew worse. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident took place, where North Vietnamese forces attacked US ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. This led to the US Congress giving President Lyndon B. Johnson permission to send more troops to Vietnam. The United States thought it could win the war quickly, but they were wrong. The war turned into a long and bloody conflict, with the US sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers to fight in Vietnam. The fighting in Vietnam was unlike anything seen before. The US and South Vietnamese troops fought against the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and the Viet Cong, a guerrilla force in the south. The terrain in Vietnam made it difficult for US troops. The dense jungles, rivers, and swamps gave the enemy the perfect environment to hide and launch surprise attacks. The Viet Cong used tunnels and hidden bases to strike and then vanish, making it hard for US forces to fight back. The war was brutal. Bombing raids, ground battles, and chemical warfare caused immense destruction. One of the most controversial tactics was the use of Agent Orange, a powerful herbicide that stripped the jungle of cover and caused lasting health problems for both soldiers and civilians. As the war went on, more and more Americans began to question why the US was involved in Vietnam. The war seemed endless, and the US military wasn't making much progress. As the number of American casualties grew, protests against the war became stronger. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, many young people in the US started protesting, holding demonstrations, and organizing marches. The anti-war movement grew, with people calling for the US to withdraw from Vietnam. The protests were often met with violence, but they made it clear that the public was losing faith in the war effort. In 1968, the North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive, a massive surprise attack on cities and towns in South Vietnam. Even though the attack was repelled and the North Vietnamese suffered heavy losses, the Tet Offensive showed that the war was far from over. This attack shocked the American public and led many to realize that victory in Vietnam was not going to come easily. The media began to show the horrors of the war on TV, and the public's opinion turned more against the conflict. By the early 1970s, US troops were beginning to withdraw from Vietnam. The policy of Vietnamization was put in place, meaning that the US would train South Vietnamese forces to take over the fight. However, the South Vietnamese military was not strong enough to stand on its own. In 1973, the US signed a peace agreement with North Vietnam, and American troops finally left. But the fighting didn't stop. The war continued for another 2 years, with North Vietnam pushing forward. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, marking the end of the war. Vietnam was reunified under communist rule, and the country became known as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The Vietnam War left a deep scar on both Vietnam and the United States. Millions of people lost their lives, an estimated 3 million Vietnamese and over 58,000 Americans. The war also left the country in ruins, with cities destroyed and farmland contaminated. For the US, the war caused a loss of confidence in the government and military. Many soldiers returned home to find that they were not welcomed and faced a country divided over the war. The Vietnam War is a story of both failure and resilience. It showed the dangers of foreign intervention and the complexities of fighting in a country with a culture and terrain that was unfamiliar. It also highlighted the power of public opinion in shaping a nation's actions. Today, the Vietnam War remains a painful chapter in history, but it also teaches us about the cost of war, the importance of diplomacy, and the need to understand the cultures and people we engage with. The Vietnam War was a conflict that changed the world. It shaped the Cold War, changed American foreign policy, and impacted Vietnam in ways that are still felt today. As we reflect on this history, we remember the lives lost and the lessons learned. Thank you for watching this documentary. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories from our world's history.